Dr. Alison Stapleton, Dr. Alison Stapleton, to talk about what I think is a really exciting work in the space of doing ACT and psychological flexibility-based work with adolescents, and particularly, I think, really outstanding work in the field of SCEDS, or single case experimental design. I kind of feel like as our community globally moves into an age of really trying to pursue individualized, kind of person-centered, evidence-based and process-based care, Alison's work, in my opinion, is exemplary in this field and helps light the way for many of us to do great work. So I won't say any more than that. I'll just well, one thing I will say is that I'm having a few tech issues. So Chris is host. I'm going to jump out in a second and try to get off of my current phone way of dialing in and onto a laptop, but that shouldn't disrupt anything in terms of Alison's presentation. So yeah, have a great session, and over to you. Thanks very much, Alison.
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks to the SIG as well for having me speaking here today. Just going to pull up slides. Okay. And someone might just nod for me so that I know that they're displayed. Fabulous, thank you. Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Alison, and I'm a postdoc working in Ireland. At the moment I'm joining you from Sicily, which has been really exciting, and also a real opportunity to kind of learn more about the single case experimental design pieces that I'm going to be chatting about today. So it's a particularly exciting time to be interested in these things, I think. So the topic that we're going to cover today is small and mighty, which is intentionally meant to be a play on words of like a small n, or a small number of people, yet still having that mighty statistical power that people are often looking for when they're doing this kind of work, especially if they're predominantly in research contexts. And ultimately what we're going to be looking at is how we can use these kinds of small and mighty designs with children and adolescents. And we'll give a specific example of one of my papers that had looked at acceptance and commitment therapy with a group of teenagers. The plan is for me to probably talk for about 45 minutes-ish, and then I'll open up for questions. But if there are any that do pop up as we're going along, do just pop them into the chat or raise your hand, and we can address them as they show up, given that the number of us here today. So objectives, or the pieces that I'd like for us to cover. First, I'd like for us to be able to describe types of single case experimental designs. So there's different ways that these things might look, regardless of whether you're approaching it from a research or a more applied perspective. I'll also talk about some of the findings from my own recent work with the adolescents, which I had mentioned, and I'll be doing that from the perspective of what the actual outcome measures indicated, but also what my own experience of it was as the person delivering the ACT intervention and as the researcher responsible for collecting the data that we were analysing. And then the last piece here, I'd say this is more of work for yourselves as we're going through it, is being able to evaluate the feasibility of these kinds of approaches in your context. And I'm not sure of everyone's background, but as we're going through this, hopefully you'll get a stronger sense of, you know, what SCEDS involve, the kinds of resources that you might require, so that you could then form an opinion as to whether they are feasible in your context, or indeed, if they don't yet seem feasible, what might you add in to make it more likely that you can use these kinds of approaches. So that's a general plan. And again, as I said, I'll be speaking for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll have either some questions or just a general chat about this particular topic. Okay, so some kinds of helpful context here. You may or may not have seen these terms floating around in ACBS. So terms like aggregate or ergodic, idionomic, idiographic, nomothetic, lots of terms which may or may not be familiar to people. And I think when we are covering single case experimental designs, it can be helpful even just to have a reminder of what people mean when they're using these terms, because I think it can be very easy to get lost along the way, especially if these are things that we're less familiar with. So one of the main reasons people have become increasingly interested in single case experimental designs relates to some of the assumptions that underlie our group designs and the stats that we tend to use with our group designs. Now, when I say group designs here, you could think of an example being your traditional randomized control trial or your RCT. In that kind of group design, usually you'd be using a statistical test like a t-test or an ANOVA to compare the averages or the mean of your groups across time. However, kind of recently within ACBS and not so recently outside of ACBS, people have been asking about the extent to which what we say about a group applies to an individual. Because as we know, we can have a mean of a sample or a mean of a population, and that's going to be impacted by outliers. Or there are going to be people in the data set that differ radically from others. And for those that differ, the mean or the average is not going to be a very useful predictor of their score or of their behaviour. So what we're tending to ask now is, in what context can we say that a group level finding applies to an individual? Or when is it likely that our mean is going to map on directly to one individual person's experience? There has been a suggestion that we need to meet ergodic conditions for this to be possible. So another way to say that is, if you want to apply group level data to an individual, you have to meet two very specific conditions. And the argument is that people don't meet those conditions. Now, the first condition is that they must be stationary or still unchanging. And the second condition is that all the elements or all the components must obey the same dynamic model. And Steve has put it a bit more plainly here. Basically, you can't apply group level data unless you think people are frozen clones. And that's kind of his suggestion or his argument here. And we would not tend to understand people as frozen clones. So it is questionable whether or not we can apply group level data to the individual. So because we aren't certain about times the mean applies to an individual's experience, people are starting to shift away from relying solely on randomized control trials or solely on those group designs. And I'm trying my best now to be very careful with the ways I'm talking about these things, because I think that there is genuine value to having your group designs, to having your RCTs. I think in a lot of contexts, they're still seen as that gold standard evidence. And if we just completely cut them off and say that they're a waste of time, we might be making things, needlessly difficult for ourselves. So rather than saying we should never do them, I'm really trying to remember to say out loud, we shouldn't only be doing them. We should be doing a range of things, and ideally that range would include our single case designs. So again, I'm conscious that, these things might be fairly new. And so I think it can be helpful to have some tangible examples just to really drive home these terms, especially if they are unfamiliar. So on the screen at the moment, we have two graphs, and these graphs are depicting the number of typing errors that people make and how quickly they are typing in terms of words per minute. And if we look at our group level data, which is on the leftmost portion of our screen, what we see here is that it looks as though the faster people type, the less mistakes they make. And as someone who can get a bit frantic at times and absolutely makes lots of typos, that doesn't ring true, or that doesn't feel accurate for me. Because the faster I'm typing, the more mistakes I'm making. And in this particular example, when we zoom in, rather than only looking at our averages, when we look at our individual people's data points, what we can see is that the faster they're typing, the more typing errors they're making. So what this means is, at times, looking at group level data can be misleading. At times, group level data will not apply to the individual that you are considering. And ultimately, that is part of the rationale for why we're starting to shift towards single case experimental designs. I'm not sure if anyone here is a behavior analyst, but if you are, you might have cringed when I said we're starting to shift over, because like, of course, behavior analysis would largely have been this way all along. So maybe it's more accurate for me to say we're coming back around to the good side of doing single case experimental designs. And I'll thank you for forgiving my lack of precision there. Okay. The final set of examples here, and again, I do think that these can be helpful when we're trying to approach what might be new terminology. On the screen at the moment, we have three of our key terms. So we have nomothetic, idiographic, and idionomic. Now, when I say nomothetic, I'm talking about those group designs. So again, think of your RCT. If we were using a nomothetic approach, we might make statements like, on average, teens are stressed during exam time. And that might be the kind of statement that we're making. And what we can say about that is, it is useful, so it's helpful to know on average they are stressed. However, it does not apply to everyone. So it's useful up to a point, because it's not going to be applicable to all teenagers. On the other hand, if we were to take an idiographic approach, so when we say idiographic here, you can imagine we're talking about individuals rather than groups. So this would be our single case experimental design approaches. What we might be saying here is, with our really zoomed in perspective on an individual experience, we could say things like, well, teenager A feels stressed because they forgot their pencil case. Teenager B feels tired because they didn't sleep very well. They were worrying about the exam the night before. But, teenager C is delighted. They feel energized and motivated because they really love having tests of their knowledge. Now, I don't relate to that teenager at all, but that could be their experience, okay? And what we're seeing here is we have this really rich understanding of these individual people's experiences. However, it is going to be difficult for us to give advice to teachers or to parents of those teenagers, right? Because we only know who we know. And what about the other kids in the class who we just haven't yet asked? Can we give accurate advice about them? Not necessarily, right? Not unless they're teenager A, B, or C, because we don't know. So what I'm trying to show here is that there is usefulness to the groups, there's usefulness to the individual approaches, and ultimately, if you put those together, so if you combine nomothetic and idiographic, you get idionomic, but you get the best of both worlds, because you're putting these two different ways of looking at people together. And if we were to do that with this particular example, we might be asking questions like, are there subgroups of teenagers that are presenting with similar stress patterns? And can we use that information to improve how we're supporting them individually? So can we make the advice that we give their parents, their teachers, other community members even better than it already is? So really importantly there with your idionomic approaches, we don't throw away that individual detail. We don't lose the richness. Instead, what we might be trying to do is build up these subgroup patterns or these, presentation clusters, and ultimately try to improve our understanding of most individuals. So we're bringing all of this together to ultimately improve our ability to intervene and even just understand. So far what we've done is some kind of introductory context for single case experimental designs. And at this point, the only thing I'd be expecting people to have an awareness of is the fact that You have your group approaches, you have your individual approaches, and what we're moving towards now is putting those together and having our idionomic approaches. And so again, one of the objectives, or what I was hoping to cover in this session, was to look at our kinds of single case experimental designs. Remembering that single case experimental designs are idiographic approaches. So on the screen at the moment, we have a flow chart, and this would be one that people would tend to refer to when they're designing a SCED or single case experimental design study. And we can see that it starts quite broadly by talking about research questions or general research area, and it moves into more of the specifics of, for example, your assessment protocol. Now, I think when we're considering teams, talking about the kinds of data that you're going to collect is particularly interesting. So I do want to touch on that before I talk about the specific design types that people tend to use. So we'll start to talk about that now. In terms of our specific data collection strategies, a lot of people would use EMA, or ecological momentary assessment, which basically means asking a person about their experience in this moment. So that could be an example of an EMA. There are, of course, other ways that we can get these kinds of data. So, for example, if you are working with young people, you could be collecting those kinds of data in your sessions. And sometimes people say that collecting those kinds of data in sessions, so in applied practice, can be a way that we start to bridge the supposed gap between research and practice. What it actually would entail is repeatedly sampling your client's behaviours in session. So whether that means you're asking them a particular question or providing a certain questionnaire over and over again at the start of each session, or whether that means you're tracking, for example, observable behaviour. It means collecting that data from a person again and again. And the reason the repetition is important is because that's how we start to map change within an individual. That's how we start to get the rich level of detail that is very difficult to acquire from an RCT alone. So in terms of some of the specific examples or ways that people have been doing this in their practice, I've linked on screen one of the studies from Dr. Daniela Salazar, and in her work she was trying to support groups of children, and she had them complete measures of psychological flexibility, repetitive negative thinking, and generalized pliance weekly for a period of 12 weeks. So by the end of her intervention sessions with them, she had approximately 12 data points per child that she was working with, and she was able to see trends in their scores over time. So like, for example, an increase in psychological flexibility, a decrease in problematic repetitive negative thinking. Now, of course, there are limitations to this particular approach. So imagining you only get to work with your young person for 1 hour a week. Do you really want to spend the first 15 minutes having them fill in the same questionnaire over and over? There is also a risk that you might have the young person getting fed up. Maybe they're dying to chat with you about how their week was, so they're just taking anything to get over it so that they can get into their session that they're there for. And of course, that makes total sense. So it's not that our SCEDs are without their limitations, it's that we need to be aware of them and account for them when we're designing and then when we're starting to implement those particular approaches. Another limitation with using your in-session kinds of collection is that oftentimes when people do it, they're not able to contact real-world experiences. Now, they can capture the in-session experiences, which are, of course, very important, but there's a major difference between asking someone to report about what they recalled feeling in a moment of being stressed in school and actually asking them when they're stressed in school, how are you feeling, what are you thinking? And so trying to get around that issue of not being able to access behaviour in the real world, people do tend to use ecological momentary assessments. So again, that's where you're repeatedly sampling your participants' current behaviors and experiences in real time. And it's in their natural environment. It's an ecological momentary assessment. So that means you're asking them in the environment that they get stressed to talk about their stress, for example. And so it's giving you that really rich understanding that is in its own context. It's not divorced from the environment in which it happens. Um, Now, with our ecological momentary assessments, we are trying to get a high number of data points per person because, again, we want to have enough information that we can start to model change over time, whether that time is a period of weeks or a period of months. We also want to consider whether it's going to be intermittent or continuous. When I say continuous here, I'm talking about things like your wearable health device that might count your steps every day, versus if I'm talking about intermittent, where I'm relying on a particular event. So to give another example of this, if I was interested in stress and I wanted to use a continuous EMA, maybe I'm using something like your wearable health device that's tracking your heart rate, and I'm using heart rate as a proxy for stress. Whereas if I'm using an intermittent approach, maybe I'm looking at, okay, every time you open your emails and you see how many are unread, track your stress, tell me how stressed you are. Right, so intermittent is based on that event. When you open your emails, tell me about your stress. And there are other approaches as well that people could look into. So daily diaries are another one. And they can be quite popular, especially for people who are in that kind of more applied space because it's not eating into your session time. But again, depending on the young people that you're working with, maybe they're just not into journaling and doing diaries. So there's lots of ways of approaching these things, and I think it's important to have that kind of broad view of it, because the more different things we're aware of, the more likely it is we'll find one that'll actually slot in comfortably with existing ways of working. So to that end, on screen at the moment, I've just linked a few pieces that I do find quite helpful for this. I know that this is being recorded and I can send the slides on as well if people want. But if you are interested in learning more about this, I think especially the first two websites linked there would be particularly good starting points. And what they're especially good at is helping you to collect data, and they are mostly free. I think if you get higher than 100 participants, it wants you to start paying for it. But I think single case design having 100 would be quite a lot, and so you might get a good amount of use out of them before then. And just to tell you how I have done SCEDS so far, and I see a chat message as well. Gives a sec here, it's fighting with me. Path is great. I agree. Yeah, that was nice. I agree. How I've done this so far as someone who has trust issues with technology and likes control, I have been individually texting all of the participants that have been enrolled in my SCEDS. So the study that I'll mention later on, there were 10 young people who were enrolled, and I was texting them every single day for a period of 69 days. And also, my young people were not inclined to fill in their measures in the morning when they were first sent, so I'd have to send them in the evening as well. So that's 10 times 2 times 69. That's how many text messages I was sending there. Or more recently, I was doing a sked with farmers, and again, it was, I think, 55 days, and there was 18 farmers times 2 texts every day. And so from the research side of it, it can be labor intensive, but perhaps that is my own fault for just not getting on board with the technology. And so if you're newly stepping into the sked space, I would advise early adoption of the tech. Just to save a lot of heartache and having to have a lot of alarms in your phone to remind you not to forget to text your participants every day. Okay. So in terms of the types of data that we tend to collect, it can be helpful to break them down across categories. So I quite like that approach. One of the ones that's quite popular is looking at data in terms of whether it's an experience, an observable behavior, or physiology. And again, if any behavior analysts are here, I know it's all behavior, they're all things that we do. And yet I think it's nice to have this kind of breakdown across three categories. So when they're talking about experience, what they're referring to is self-report. So like, for example, if I asked you to rate your stress right now on a scale of 1 to 10, that would be an example of an experience EMA. And it would also be active. And the reason I would use the adjective active there is because you have to do something to give me that data. You have to tell me your rating on a scale of 1 to 10. And when we're thinking about not burdening the people that we work with any further, if you have an active measure or an active approach to collecting your EMAs, that is increasing the burden on that person. Like, for example, with my 10 teenagers, they had to actively click a link, fill in their numbers for that day, and then send them to me. So there was that kind of added burden for them. So experience there, self-report. For observable behavior, they tend to talk about your wearable technology. And some of the recent or relatively recent papers looking at this, linked on screen, try to use GPS, which can identify your location, and other kind of phone usage data to predict depression symptom severity. So they were using things like social withdrawal as a proxy for depression, and they were able to access that kind of data based on where someone was located on a map. So if they weren't leaving their house, they could pick up on that and they could infer conclusions about depressive symptom severity. And that type of data collection there would be passive. And the reason we would say passive is because it is not requiring the participant to do anything extra to give the data. It's just being collected automatically. And again, a benefit to that is it is reducing the burden somewhat. Although we do have to think about if it's a wearable technology or wearable device, who's charging it? What happens if they forget to charge it? What if they break it? All of these kinds of things can impact on whether you're getting that information back. The final category here is related to physiology. And so an example here would be blood pressure. Importantly, these are not only for your interventions targeting physical activity or these other kinds of health behaviors. Like, for example, Maria Caracalla in her lab found that skin conductance, heart rate variability, and even facial muscle activity could categorize people correctly into whether they were high or low on experiential avoidance. So these kinds of physiological measures are really interesting and actually can be related to variables that we might more traditionally be interested in, like Cyflex or like experiential avoidance. So that's a kind of overview of the kinds of data that you might be interested in collecting. And again, what's feasible for you will depend on your context. One of the pieces that I'd really liked, and I'd heard about it from Evie Gould, related to having a client identify a behavior that they would like to track and then encouraging them to be the researcher over the week and kind of keep track of it themselves and bring it back to you. And in that way, you're having them involved in actually looking at their individual behavior, noticing it over time. And if you are doing values pieces around that same period, it's actually acting as a cue then that could orient them towards those values guided behaviors. So actually involving young people in this data collection process can be a real benefit as well. So some final pieces here in terms of the kinds of data that you're collecting. Something I find really entertaining in the SCED space is looking at how people try to break your data collection method. And so on screen at the moment, there's an image which I think is hard to decipher if you don't know what it is. So I'll explain it. This particular image here is a remote control car. And strapped onto the car, you have a pedometer or a device that counts your steps. And someone had figured out that if they drove the remote control car while the step counter was attached, the step counter would go up and they were hitting all their goals and they were getting all the reinforcement for hitting all their goals without actually having to go out and do all the steps. I'd heard a GP a couple of years ago saying that people learned they could throw their pedometers in the washing machine, and people are really creative, and the rat is never wrong, right? People are doing these things for a reason, And so I think it's our responsibility to identify, what we're incentivizing. So are we incentivizing just hitting the number, or, can we turn the other things into the reinforcers, like noticing a difference in your capacity for going on walks, or these other kinds of natural reinforcers versus the contrived arbitrary ones that we might be awarding for just hitting a number on a step counter. So we need to think about that. And we also need to think about, can people cheat, or why would they cheat, and approaching it more functionally. Because otherwise we run the risk of putting all the time in and thinking that we're doing what's working and thinking that we're getting good data, only for that not to be the case. So having all of your pilots is especially important for your single case experimental designs as well. And a final piece here relates to missing data. So one of the pieces we've signposted already is that there can be a lot of burden involved in submitting your data for a SCED. So again, think of my example of the 10 young people who were rating themselves on 3 different scales for a period of 69 days. That's a lot to ask of a young person who was presenting with, for example, clinically significant anxiety. Like, be consistent for 69 days and send me these 3 questions when I ask you to, right? That's intense. And so understandably, you could have missing data, right? There might be a day where there is so much happening, they just can't send it in. Or there might be a day where they're like, you know what, this sucks and I'm not doing it anymore, and they don't send it in. And that's fine, right? That's to be expected. But what you need to do is think about, okay, how can I limit the missing data? Or like, can I approach this in a way that's going to burden them less? What am I doing that's maybe creating this aversive context where they're committing to something with me and then not following through? So I think really need to consider these things up front and kind of plan in advance, just to prevent all of those issues from showing up down the line. So there's some general recommendations that people tend to give in relation to limiting missing data on screen at the moment. Some of them I am not too sure about, like, for example, incentivizing a certain level of completeness. That might look like if you submit 60 out of the 69 required responses, you get entered into a lottery or something like that. I have some reservations about using that kind of approach because I don't want someone to feel as though they have to fill in a measure just to get something from it. I think that gives me the ick a bit. Whereas other kinds of suggestions here, like giving individualized feedback, seems much more appealing to me. Because if we can talk with someone like, hey, when we started our work together, you were kind of around here, and now we're coming towards the end of our work together and you're more consistently up around here. I think that not only is giving someone information powerful, it seems much more appropriate to me. So these are our other considerations. So kind of coming back to this flowchart that I'd signposted earlier, if we've identified our research question or what we're interested in, and if we're thinking about the kinds of data that we're going to collect, the way in which we're going to collect it, we might start to then think about the specific design that we're going to use. So I'm just going to signpost some of the more popular ones, and I will have examples linked on the screen. So if you do want to learn more about the specifics, you're very welcome to go off and do that. So one of the more popular designs here is termed an observational N of 1 design. And what this means is we have one single phase of longitudinal measurement of our variables of study. So usually when people have diagrams from observational N of 1 studies, your x-axis would be time. So like, for example, here we're going from day 1 to day 85. And your y-axis here would be your variable that you're measuring. You could imagine that this is stress. So maybe this is higher stress, this is lower stress. That's what your observational N of 1 would tend to look like. There is no experimental manipulation per se, so there's no intervention involved in an observational N of 1. We're just observing over time. Oftentimes in our sphere, so in CBS, people are interested more in phase designs because in a phase design, you usually do have an intervention. So a really common example of a phase design is A-B, where A would refer to your baseline and B would refer to your intervention. So we could imagine here that we have a baseline period before you start your work with the young person, and then we have the intervention period where you are working with the young person. Now, when your particular approach involves something like ACT or something like mindfulness, it is not truly possible to return to baseline. So it is not possible for us to teach all of these skills and then rip them completely away again. And for that reason, you could not have a true return to baseline. Instead, what would be much more common would be to describe that kind of approach as just an A-B rather than an ABA. Or sometimes, and I've done it in my own work, I do big A, big B, little a, because it's not really a true return to baseline. I don't know if you can hear that, but someone's banging on this door, so I think I'm just going to check everything's okay and I'll be back in a second. Sorry.
Hello.
Okay, I think it's loading. Hi everyone. So Nanny Presty wants to say hello, and Maria Caracula and Louise McHugh.
Hello.
How are you?
Hi, Nanny.
Hi, nice to meet you. Next time you need to reach us here, join us
In Sicily.
in Sicily.
Sounds
Have
good.
a nice meeting. Goodbye. See you later.
See you.
I've booked the event.
Cool.
So I plan on the
Cool. Sorry everyone. I'm really glad I opened the door. That wasn't that really lovely and nice mobilizing energy. Good job all. Okay. So phase designs, again, we can't rip away psychological skills. And so for that reason, we would tend to describe studies using psychological interventions as A-B only. There might be other designs that we could actually do a true return to baseline. Yesterday, one of the examples that someone had given was if we were working with children with ADHD in an educational setting, maybe we have a baseline period where there's no support, then we have our intervention period where there is a support, so someone who will bring them for their movement break, for example, and then, although unethical, we could, in theory, pull that person away and have a true return to baseline. And what we would expect to see there might be, an improvement in motivation to attend school, enjoyment in school during the intervention period, and then a decline or deterioration when we have that return to baseline. And if you observe that improvement, deterioration consistently and reliably, then we start to get more and more confident that our intervention is actually effective for that particular person. So that would be our phase design. And the last set of designs here that I'll signpost are changing criterion and alternating treatment designs. Now, alternating treatment designs here are exactly what they say on the tin, or their name is quite apt. And so what that means is we have our baseline, then perhaps we're trying a supportive person being present, so like someone to bring the child on a movement break, and then we're switching and trying something else different. Maybe we're integrating mindfulness training. And because we have that switch from one type of intervention to another, and it's in phases, we describe it as an alternating treatment design. Changing criterion design, however, would mean that we have our baseline period, then we introduce our intervention, and as the intervention progresses, we increase our criterion, or we higher our standard as we go along. An example here that just seems really relevant to me at the moment is I've been learning how to work out properly. And so you're encouraged to hit certain moderate physical activity goals each week. And after a while of a particular type of moderate physical activity, your heart rate is no longer hitting that range because your body's gotten used to doing that particular workout. And so if you want to stay in that moderate space, you have to, for example, increase the speed on the treadmill to get your heart rate back up. And so I'm increasing. I'm changing my criterion. And that's what's happening in your changing criterion design. So we've done our rationale, we've talked about the kinds of data that we tend to collect, and we've signposted some of the specifics of the design. The last piece that I'll be showing is some of the findings from one of my papers. I have it linked on screen if people do want to take a closer look. There will be some figures that I'll share, and they are slightly difficult to read just in the smaller version. So if you do want to learn more about them, that would be your reference there. So I've talked about it a bit as I've gone on, but in terms of the specific method, I was looking at the impact of a 10-session weekly group-based ACT intervention that I had delivered over Zoom. And this had taken place during COVID and had formed part of my PhD studies. In terms of the kinds of data that I'd collected, I had a mix of standardized questionnaires that I'd asked the children to fill in before and after the intervention. And I also used ecological momentary assessments, or EMA. And I collected EMAs each day for a period of 69 days. Now, I did use a phase design, so it was A-B, or as I wrote it at the time, big A, big B, little a, because I couldn't truly return to baseline. My baseline period was 14 days for everyone, and then my intervention period was 45 days, followed by my 10-day little a, or follow-up where no active intervention was happening in that week. What I was interested in doing was looking at the group level, so mean changes in, for example, distress, like the PHQ-9 scores, or psychological inflexibility, and also individual change according to the EMAs. So the specific EMAs that I used in the study are on screen at the moment. I looked at avoidance, where I asked people to rate the truthfulness of the following item. I stopped doing things that were important to me whenever I felt bad, and that was on a 5-point scale ranging from 1 to 5. I was also interested in generalized appliance. If people are not familiar with this term, it basically means following rules for the sake of following rules. Or another way to say that might be particularly relevant for young people is being especially sensitive to peer pressure. The way I targeted that was to rate the truthfulness of the following item. Making an effort is only worth it if others recognize it. And finally then, I wasn't sure whether I would actually change generalized pliance, but perhaps I could change how people understood pliance. And so for that reason, I also asked them, how useful is it to be pliant? Because, it was a relatively short intervention period. Maybe we're still being pliant, but maybe now we have different thoughts about it. So I asked people to rate how useful it was to think that making an effort is only worth it if others recognize it. In terms of my participants, I had 11 that were initially recruited and 5 had withdrawn. The actual number of withdrawals from the study was at 5, but 4 of them still took part in the full whack of the intervention, so they were still coming each week, and that was actually really important to me because I didn't want them to feel as though they had to do this thing that I did think was relatively torturous, committing to something for 69 days. I wanted them to know that they were still very welcome to go to the intervention. So my final sample that were included in the study were 6 white young people that were aged 16 to 19 years, predominantly female. And before the intervention, they were experiencing moderate, moderately severe, severe depressive symptoms. So it was a clinical sample here. On the screen at the moment, I have the data from the standardized measures, and I've color coded it a bit just to try and make it easier to see at a glance. But basically green would mean a desired change or what we would expect to see, and the red would mean something that would be undesired or would reflect deterioration, for example. So on average, descriptively, we had reductions in anxiety, psychological inflexibility, cognitive fusion, and generalized compliance. And we also, really interestingly, had an increase in depressive symptoms. If you look here at participants 3 and 4, so that's these two rows here, they show desired changes on all self-report measures. And if we look at participants 5 and 6, so these rows here, they had the fewest desired changes, and they actually had increases in generalized compliance and depressive symptoms, respectively. What's particularly interesting here, and it's a shame I have them so small, these are my outcomes from my EMA data collection. So if we look here, each of these bars represents one child over time. So the length of these is that 69-day period. Where we have the dark grey shaded region, that's my intervention or my B phase. And I have it done for avoidance, pliance, and perceived ply workability. So my 3 EMAs. In terms of how I analysed those data, I had used Dr. Ian Hussey's ORA package to create these visuals. And in terms of the stats that I'd used, I had a non-overlap of all pairs, which basically looks at the chance that a randomly selected data point from phase B is superior to a randomly selected data point from phase A. And what we were also able to do here was a meta-analysis. Maybe putting this a bit more simply, what that meant was I could look at change for each individual person and see whether it was significant for them within themselves over time. And I could also look at them as a group. So really trying to bring together that idionomic part of individual and group all at once. And so when I did that, looking at these here, I had reductions in avoidance ratings significant for 5 out of the 6 participants. If you look here at participant 5, I think their scores are especially interesting. So theirs was not statistically significant. And if you're able to see here, it's pretty much a straight line with the exception of one day where they reported something different. I would love to know what happened on that day because I'm just so curious. I never will know. But how interesting is that? It was totally consistent until this one day and then back. So for them, there was no statistically significant difference or reduction there. In terms of my pliance measure here, I had significant reductions in generalized pliance for 4 out of the 6 participants. And again, noticing here that consistency in participant 5, which did carry on here to perceived ply workability. And in terms of perceived ply workability, I had those significant reductions for only 3 out of the 6, so only 50% of the young people there. Just to make some kind of general comments on those data, when I was to look at the group level, so using my meta-analysis, the intervention seemed to significantly impact avoidance and pliance, but not perceived ply workability, which is interesting because that's not what I might have expected. When I look at that more individual perspective, again, I'm seeing those changes for 5 out of 6 and 4 out of 6 for avoidance and pliance respectively. Slight difference there in the consistency for perceived ply workability. I did have that low variability in participants 5's daily ratings, so across those 69 days, again, I'm so interested and curious and I will probably never know. And I did notice that there was some ambiguity in my third ecological momentary assessment, because something that's very interesting about pliance is that although we might talk about workability and stuff in ACT, in natural language, if I say how useful is this for someone, pliance is so useful. Like if you're a people pleaser, you're pleasing people, right? And they like you. And so as a young person, that can be really useful. You might say that that's really useful. And so I think perhaps my phrasing was slightly off for that EMA, and I think that rings true in what I observed. So remember, for only half of the kids was there a significant reduction there. So just checking my time. Oh, okay, grand. Last pieces here are just some other kinds of useful resources again. I do think that these can be good starting off points, especially if these are things that you might not have been familiar with before or things that you're hoping to integrate into your practice. And so I might just stop here and see if there's any questions or discussion.
Thanks, Alison. That was incredibly interesting as ever. Could listen to you for a lot longer. Anybody in the group have any questions for Alison at this point? Feel free to unmute. We're a relatively small group, so Sherry?
I just want to say thank you. That was fantastic, and it's nice to be with people today. And Alison, I agree with what Duncan said. I could listen to you for days at a time. You're so clear. Thank you very much. It's just given me a lot to think about. So that's kind of where my brain comes to an abrupt halt, is just needing some time to take it all in and wonder what I might do with it. But you've certainly given me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. Anybody else got any questions? No such thing as a silly question. Oh, I've got one then. Okay, so Alison, what I've actually written down lots of questions, but I'll try not to hog too much of everybody's time. One thing I wonder about is for people taking their first or thinking about taking their first foray into SCEDS, what advice would you give them about a potentially workable first step into using this kind of method in your work? You know, what would be like a low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, great question. I really like the idea of coming up with something with the young person that you're working with. So like agreeing on, a behavior or something that you're both going to track over the week, and you do it for yourself, they do it for themselves. And then when you meet again, kind of look at what you noticed, and maybe if it does function as that kind of reminder of values or that kind of encouragement, or how you might get a streak and that's motivating in and of itself to maintain a particular behavior. If it is working that way and it is helpful, then perhaps retaining it or keeping that log, and while also understanding that there were parts of the intervention where I had asked the young people to do, like, I didn't call it homework because that felt cringy, but like home practice, I think I called it. And they did not do the home practice. I was like, I totally know why you did not do the home practice. And it didn't seem to matter how easy I thought it was. It just wasn't getting done. So we might be trying to come up with these, logs or tracking behaviors over the week, and it doesn't get done. And that's data too, right? That's interesting. So I think even just trying it once and seeing how you get on, you'll learn loads even from that.
I love that idea of so if I understand you correctly, set yourself a goal in your conversation with the young person, work with the young person to set them a goal, and so you could kind of report on it together, almost go on a journey of encountering challenges as you try and move toward your own personal goals. There's a real sense of togetherness in there. I love that idea. I'm going to ask another question, but if people want to unmute and ask questions, then please do. One of the things that we often notice with the young people that we work with is at baseline, as in at the point where we're about to start active intervention, we often get what we think are highly pliant responses. In other words, we think that our young people are often telling us what they think we want to hear. And often that means they're scoring really high on, say, an ideographic measure or an idionomic item. And of course, that's kind of problematic, because when they start giving more tracked responses, it can look like we've actually done harm. It can look like things have gone bad. But in actual fact, we're just getting a more accurately tracked response, a more honest response, if you like. I wonder if you encounter any of those kinds of issues and what advice you'd give to people trying to do this work when that kind of stuff shows up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's spot on as well. kind of more recently, as I'd mentioned, I've been doing the single case designs with the farming population in Ireland. And one of the recent studies that we had wrapped up was looking at clinically significant distress. So our participants there were required to fill in a screener, I think it was the DAS, and if they were reporting clinically significant distress per that measure, they received an invite to join the study. And in Ireland, I think with the way stigma has kind of endured or continues to be, as soon as our farmers were told, hey, you're eligible because you reported clinically significant distress, they were all like, no, I'm grand actually, and I I take that back, and I understand why that happened. And also it was difficult to explain to other people how these farmers went from, you know, clinically significant distress to not having any clinically significant distress according to that measure in the space of 1 week. And it does happen. So what we had decided to do then was we put in kind of an ethical amendment, because this was in a research context, to request permission to ask the participants their perspective on that. So we were able to present them with their scores kind of the week before when they were deemed eligible, and then at the entry point to the study where they were not reporting clinically significant distress, and just kind of asked them like, oh, you know, is there anything going on for you that particular week? Did anything change? It was interesting for me trying to think of how to pose the question, because I didn't want to give the impression, I don't believe you, and I think I think you're maybe saying this because I made you feel awkward about your distress. Because I do want to believe people when they tell me their ratings. It's just so curious that it changed so rapidly. But I think approaching it from that place of, you know, can you talk? What do you think of this? And you know, is there anything? So being open, and also understanding that minds are really good storytellers. So like if you ask me to tell me a story about why this is the case, I can totally do that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an accurate description. So I think maybe asking them, but also just having the understanding that we might be seeing that shift from compliance to tracking. So from just saying what we think they want to hear to actually saying what feels true and authentic.
Nice, thank you. I
Can
have
I
got
ask
one more
something if
question,
that's
but yeah, go
okay?
on, Patricia. Yeah.
Alison, so can I just kind of clarify how you did the measurements? Because like in my experience, when we try to use measurement instruments, we might have a questionnaire, and it sounds like you did more of a chatty interaction with them. Because, you know, when we use questionnaires that is going to be continuously throughout sessions, we find that the young people are not necessarily familiar with ACT language or the processes that we want to record or measure or track, or that, you know, there are differences in language, how they understand certain terminology that is ACT-based or DNAB-based. So it'd be helpful to know how you took that those measurements with chatty questionnaires as well as explanations, and how was that?
Yeah, good question. So for that particular study, I had only used the 3 items that I displayed on screen. So it wasn't full questionnaires, it was just 3 items drawn from questionnaires. And the way that they were presented to the kids is that I would text them each day those same 3 questions. And at the entry point to the study, I had a chat at the start of our group session and explained what I meant by each of those. However, I don't think that was foolproof, especially when I considered the apply workability one, because of course pliance is useful, and I know that, and that's not what I meant to say. I'm just noticing that my camera is fighting with me a little bit, so I hope that's not happening for other people. But what I'd meant to focus on was workability, or extent to which this helps or hinders valued living, and I didn't say that. I just said, is it useful, yes or no? So I think having those conversations can be helpful, and also does not prevent misunderstandings, or does not make things foolproof.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask just one more question, if that's okay. In the context of phase designs like AB designs, ABA designs, and ABAB designs, for example, what we often notice, you know, clinically on the ground is a tension with respect to when we move to phase B, when we move to the active intervention phase. My understanding is that generally speaking, it's best practice to try to get a stable baseline in condition A before you move to active intervention. But there are often tensions there because this is a young person that needs some kind of evidence-based psychological care, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be in our line of sight. They wouldn't have been referred to our service. And I just wonder what your reflections are there with respect to walking that tightrope, if you even experience it in that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's really spot on to what does happen in the real world, and it's interesting. So there's two ways I'm aware of. The first way is your baseline does not need to be 2 weeks. So the length of your baseline and the length of your phase B should be similar. But that does not mean that they both have to be 2 weeks, 2 weeks. It could be as few as 3 days baseline, 3 days phase B. And I think if you're collecting the data over a much shorter time, you're increasing the chances that it is going to be stable, which would be something you want for your comparisons. However, there are some kinds of things you can do on the stats side of it where you can account for trends in your data. So let's imagine that as the young person knows they're going to be getting into the sessions with you, maybe they're not experiencing the same level of distress because there's that moment of like, I am going to be talking to someone, things are looking up, there is hope, that kind of experience. Maybe you're noticing a kind of downward trend in your baseline. And what you can kind of do statistically is isolate the very early part before that trend was too intense and isolate the very end part of your phase B and then run your comparisons between those isolated parts rather than just having all of the trends kind of confusing or clouding what your findings would have been.
Great stuff. Thanks, Alison. Okay, so we're a couple of minutes over, Chris and Sean, so we should probably wrap up there. I just want to say a huge thank you to Alison for a really stimulating and interesting session. I think our next session, Chris, if I'm right, is with Tom Sabo, isn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll have some details coming around to the various ACBS listservs and on social media about that soon. But yeah, Alison, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful session. I hope it's been useful for everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Alison.
everyone.
Thank you.